That cold morning, no one expected an act of kindness to change everything. What started as another day on the road became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, we show that behind the engines and the leather, there are still human hearts. The desert wind cut through the thin fabric of Jax's jacket as he pulled his Iron Hawk bike into the gravel lot of the roadside diner. It was early December, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones like regret, and the neon sign above the door flickered half-heartedly against the grey sky. "Motel 6 eats," it buzzed, one letter short of a promise. Jax killed the engine, the rumble fading into the quiet hum of idling semis on the highway. His hands, calloused from years of gripping handlebars and wrenches, lingered on the throttle a moment longer, as if holding onto the vibration could steady the knot in his chest. He'd been riding solo for weeks now, ever since the last run with the Hawks had scattered them across state lines. The Brotherhood was more than ink and oaths. It was the unspoken pact that kept them moving, kept them alive. But today, Jax wasn't chasing horizons. He was chasing a memory, a faded photo tucked in his wallet of a boy with his mother's eyes, the one thing he hadn't outrun. The diner was a pit stop, nothing more, but something in the air felt heavier, like the weight of snow yet to fall. Inside, the place smelled of burnt coffee and grease, the kind that clung to your clothes long after you'd left. A waitress with tired lines etched around her eyes poured refills at a corner booth, her movements automatic, like she'd seen too many transients to bother with smiles. Jack slid onto a stool at the counter, the vinyl creaking under his weight. "Black coffee," he muttered, his voice low, gravel rough from the road dust. She nodded, sliding a mug his way without a word. Steam rose in lazy curls, and he wrapped his fingers around it, feeling the warmth fight against the cold still radiating from his gloves. The diner wasn't empty. In the back, near the window streaked with condensation, a group of locals huddled over plates of eggs and toast. Their voices carried in murmurs, talk of the annual holiday fair in the next town over, how the volunteer fire department was dressing up some old-timer as Santa for the kids. "Poor saps," one chuckled, a trucker with a beard like steel wool. "Bikers roll through here like thunder, but it's the quiet ones who scare me." Jax didn't turn, but he felt their glances. The subtle judgment that came with his vest, the Iron Hawk patch gleaming faintly under the fluorescent lights. To them, he was just another shadow on the edge of town, heartless leather wrapped around a machine. He sipped the coffee, bitter and scalding, letting it burn away the edge of his fatigue. His mind drifted to Ellie, the single mom who'd flagged him down last night at a gas station. Her car stalled on the shoulder with rain hammering the roof like accusations. She'd had a kid in the back seat, wide-eyed and shivering, clutching a stuffed bear that had seen better days. Jax had fixed the alternator in the dark, his tools slick with water. Not for money, he'd waved off her crumpled bills, but because her hands trembled when she thanked him. A quiet plea in the way she wouldn't meet his eyes. "Merry Christmas," she'd whispered, as if the words could mend something broken. He'd nodded, revved his engine, and rode on, the rain mixing with the salt on his face. Now, as the diner's door jingled open again, letting in a gust of wind that rattled the salt shakers, Jax glanced up. A family shuffled in, Mom, Dad, 2 kids bundled in thrift store coats. The boy, maybe 7, had that hollow look of too many missed meals, his sister clinging to his arm. They took a booth near the door, the parents murmuring about skipping the fair this year, budgets tighter than the winter frost. Jax's gaze lingered on the boy, the way he traced patterns on the foggy window with a fingertip, drawing a lopsided star before wiping it away. It hit Jax like a punch to the gut, that simple gesture, echoing the drawings his own son used to leave on the fridge, back when home meant something solid. The waitress brought their order, Pancakes for the kids, black coffee for the adults. The boy dug in with quiet focus, but his eyes kept flicking to the door, as if waiting for the world to shift. Outside, the wind picked up, whipping dust across the lot where Jax's bike sat like a sentinel. He thought of the Hawk's code, whispered around campfires on long rides. Protect what's yours, even if it's not blood. But loyalty had its price, and Jax had paid it in silence, walking away from the life he'd built when the law came knocking years ago. A bar fight gone wrong, a brother lost. And suddenly he was the villain in someone else's story. The father at the booth paid with change from his pocket, coins clinking like judgments on the Formica. As they left, the boy paused by the counter, staring at a jar of tips half filled with crumpled ones. "For Santa?" he asked the waitress, voice small. She smiled faintly, ruffling his hair. "Something like that, kid." Jax watched them go, the door swinging shut behind them, the bell's echo hanging in the air. His coffee had gone cold, the mug's edge chipped like old scars. He tossed a 20 on the counter, more than enough, and stood, the stool scraping against the tile. Outside, the sky had darkened, promising rain on the asphalt ahead. Jax straddled his bike, the leather seat still warm from the ride. He pulled on his helmet, the visor fogging briefly with his breath, and fired up the engine. The roar cut through the quiet, a declaration unspoken. As he merged onto the highway, the diner shrinking in his mirrors, he couldn't shake the boy's face, the unspoken need in those drawn stars. The fair was just miles away, a cluster of lights in a forgotten town. Jax twisted the throttle, the wind rushing past like a confession. Little did he know that pull would drag him into the heart of something raw, where kindness wasn't a detour, but the only road left. The miles blurred, engines cooling in the gathering dusk, and Jax rode toward a choice that would test the quiet strength he'd buried deep. The highway stretched like a scar across the barren landscape, flanked by sagebrush that whispered secrets to the wind. Jax leaned into the curve, the Iron Hawk's engine a steady thrum beneath him, vibrating through his bones like an old wound flaring up. The fairgrounds came into view just after noon, a patchwork of faded tents and strung lights huddled against the outskirts of Willow Creek, a town so small it barely registered on maps. Smoke from food stalls curled into the crisp air, carrying the scent of caramel corn and sizzling burgers, but underneath it all lingered the dry earthiness of the desert, baked hard by endless suns. Jack slowed his bike, pulling into a gravel overflow lot where a few other rigs sat, Harleys and choppers from riders who'd wandered in for the spectacle, their patches a mosaic of forgotten allegiances. He killed the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the distant laughter of children and the low murmur of generators powering the rides. Dismounting, Jack shrugged off the road stiffness in his shoulders, his boots crunching over pebbles that scattered like hesitant thoughts. The fair was the town's lifeline this time of year, a desperate bid for normalcy amid the economic bleed-out from the shuttered mill up north. Families clustered around the Santa setup near the center, a wooden stage draped in red velvet, flanked by a lopsided Christmas tree strung with mismatched bulbs. An older man in a threadbare Santa suit waved kids over, his beard yellowed from too many smokes, but his eyes held a genuine spark, the kind earned from years of showing up despite the ache. Jax hung back near a cluster of vendor booths, his vest drawing sidelong glances from the locals. A mechanic from the auto shop on Main Street, big guy named Harlan, with grease-stained knuckles and a perpetual squint, nodded at him from across the way, where he was tinkering with a generator that kept coughing out. Harlan wasn't Iron Hawk, but he'd patched up enough of their bikes over the years to earn a quiet respect, the sort built on favors, traded in the dead of night. "Riding alone today?" Harlan called, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag that smelled of oil and rust. Jax approached, leaning against a stack of crates, the wood rough under his palm. "Yeah, just passing through." Jax's voice was even, but his eyes scanned the crowd, landing on a single mom corralling her toddler near the cotton candy stand. She looked familiar, maybe from a rest stop months back, or perhaps it was just the weariness that etched the same lines on all of them. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, strands escaping like unspoken worries, and she knelt to tie the kid's shoe. Her hands steady, but her shoulders slumped under an invisible load. Jax had seen her type before, holding it together with frayed thread, the world judging her for the cracks showing through. Harlan chuckled low, not unkindly, as he tightened a bolt. "Folks here think you lot are ghosts in leather stirring up trouble. Last year, some busybody called the sheriff on a whole crew just for parking too close to the school." He paused, his wrench pausing mid-turn, the metal glinting dully in the weak sun. "But I know better. Remember that flood 2 summers back? Hawks showed up before the state boys, sandbagging the river without asking for thanks." Jax nodded, the memory surfacing like gravel under tires. A night of relentless rain, the Brotherhood wading waist-deep, their backs to the current, saving homes that weren't theirs. No headlines, no parades. Just the quiet nod from those who'd watched from porches, rain mixing with tears. The crowd thickened around Santa's chair, kids lining up with jittery excitement, clutching drawings or toy lists scribbled on napkins. Jax watched from the periphery, the air thick with the pine scent of artificial wreaths and the faint tang of exhaust from idling trucks. A waitress from the diner, Lila, the one with the tired eyes, passed by with a tray of hot cider for volunteers, her apron dusted with flour from the bake sale. She caught Jax's gaze and offered a small smile, the kind that carried weight. "You sticking around for the lighting ceremony?" she asked, steam rising from the cups like fragile hopes. Jax shrugged, but she lingered, her voice dropping. "Heard about Ellie and her boy. Car trouble again. Folks whisper she's trouble, but she's just trying to keep the lights on." Ellie, the mum from last night, her trembling hands flashing in Jax's mind. The world saw single mothers like her as burdens, quick to label, slow to help. Jax took a cup from her tray, the warmth seeping through the paper, grounding him. "Kids shouldn't go without," he said simply, his breath visible in the cooling air. Lila nodded, her eyes flicking to the line where a boy stood apart, maybe 8 or 9, his coat too big, hanging off thin shoulders like borrowed time. The kid from the diner earlier, no, but the resemblance tugged at Jax. The way he shifted weight from foot to foot, eyes fixed on the ground, as if the joy around him was a language he couldn't speak. Santa boomed invitations, "Come sit, little ones, tell me your wishes," and the line surged forward, giggles bubbling up like soda fizz. But the boy hung back, unnoticed, his fingers twisting the hem of his sleeve, the fabric worn thin. Society's judgment hung in the air like the desert dust, settling on the edges. A cluster of townsfolk nearby muttered about those biker types, their voices laced with the fear of the unknown, painting the Iron Hawks as marauders who preyed on the weak. Jax felt it, the invisible barrier, but he also saw the truth in the small acts. Harlan sharing tools with a stranded rider, Lila slipping extra pancakes to families short on cash. The Brotherhood wasn't about thunderous entrances. It was the steady hum, the choice to stand when others turned away. Jax sipped the cider, the spice burning sweet on his tongue, and watched the boy edge closer to the stage, only to falter as a mother pulled her own child ahead, blocking the way without a glance. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the fairgrounds, the lights beginning to flicker on one by one. Jax set the cup down, the empty lot behind him echoing with the cooling tick of engines, long since silenced. Something in the boy's stance, the quiet isolation amid the cheer, stirred the knot in Jax's chest tighter. He'd walked away from his own son years ago, the guilt a shadow that rode shotgun on every mile. A veteran discharged with ghosts, A father who'd chosen the road over cribs and midnight feedings, thinking distance would protect them all from his mistakes. But protection wasn't abandonment. It was this, the pull to step into the fray. As the line thinned, Santa's voice carried over the murmurs, inviting the next child. The boy hesitated, his breath quickening in visible puffs, and Jax found himself moving forward, the gravel shifting under his boots like a decision made in silence. The crowd parted slightly, whispers trailing him, but he ignored them, his focus narrowing to the small figure ahead. Little did the town know, this detour would unravel threads of judgment, weaving them into something raw and redemptive, where a single step forward echoed louder than any engine's roar. The gravel crunched softly under Jax's boots as he closed the distance to the stage, the fairground's clamour fading into a distant hum around him. The boy's shoulders hunched further, his small frame swallowed by the oversized coat, the fabric frayed at the cuffs like edges worn by too many washes. Jax could see the rapid rise and fall of the child's chest, breaths coming in shallow bursts that misted the chill air, mirroring the quiet storm building inside him. Santa, old Harlan under the padding and whiskers, Jax realized with a start, leaned back in his chair, wiping sweat from his brow with a gloved hand, his booming voice pausing as he scanned the thinning line. The other kids had scampered off, clutching candy canes and promises, their laughter trailing like smoke from a dying fire. But this boy lingered on the periphery, invisible to the rush, his eyes fixed on the scuffed toes of his sneakers, tracing invisible lines in the dirt. Jax stopped a few feet away, the weight of his vest pulling at his shoulders, the Iron Hawk emblem catching a stray beam from the string lights flickering to life overhead. Whispers rippled through the nearby crowd, a cluster of women in holiday sweaters clutching thermoses of spiked cocoa, their gazes sharpening on him like shards of ice. "What's he doing?" one muttered, her voice low but carrying on the wind, laced with the familiar distrust that painted riders like him as interlopers, threats wrapped in chrome and leather. Jax ignored it, his focus locked on the boy, whose fingers now clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles whitening against the cold. The child couldn't have been more than 8, with hair the color of desert sand, tousled and uncombed, and eyes that held a depth of resignation far too old for his face. Jax knew that look. It was the echo of his own son's gaze in faded photographs, the one he'd left behind in a life that had cracked under the pressure of bad choices and worse luck. Harlan Santa straightened, his eyes narrowing behind the fake spectacles as he spotted the boy. "Hey there, young fella," he called, his voice gravelly but kind, the Santa inflection slipping just a touch. "You in line for a visit? Plenty of time before the lights go up full?" The boy glanced up, hope flickering briefly in his expression like a match struck in the dark. But it guttered out as a mother from the crowd stepped forward, ushering her own giggling daughter ahead. "We're next, Santa. Emily's been good all year." The interruption was casual, thoughtless, the kind born from habit in a town where the vulnerable often blended into the background. The boy retreated a step, his breath hitching audibly, and Jax felt it like a hook in his gut, the raw edge of exclusion, the silent judgment that said some kids didn't warrant the magic. He moved closer, his shadow falling across the boy, not to intimidate, but to shield. The child looked up, startled, his eyes wide and wary, searching Jax's face for intent. Up close, Jax could smell the faint trace of soap and poverty on him, the kind that came from shared bars and hand-me-downs. "You waiting your turn?" Jax asked, his voice low, steady as the idle of a well-tuned engine. Crouching slightly to meet the boy's level, the kid nodded barely, his lips pressing into a thin line, as if speaking might shatter something fragile. Jax glanced toward the stage, where Harlan was now listening to Emily's wish list with exaggerated nods, the crowd cooing appreciatively, but Jack saw the mechanic's quick side-eye, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Harlan knew the code, even if he wasn't patched in. Riders like the Hawks didn't advertise their hearts. They wore them under layers of silence and scar tissue. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of roasting chestnuts from a nearby vendor, mingling with the metallic tang of cooling metal from the rides grinding to a halt for the evening setup. Jack straightened, his hand hovering near the boy's shoulder without touching, a gesture of presence rather than possession. "Name's Jax," he said simply, the words hanging in the air like exhaust after a long ride. The boy swallowed, his throat working visibly. "Timmy," he whispered, the sound almost lost to the murmur of the fare. "Mom said, we can't afford the fare, but I snuck out. Wanted to see Santa just once." The confession landed heavy, Timmy's eyes dropping again, shame coloring his cheeks pinker than the cold. Jax's chest tightened, memories surfacing unbidden. His own boy, little Jamie at that age, drawing stars on fogged windows. Dreaming of things Jax couldn't provide after the discharge papers came, the PTSD nights turning home into a battlefield he fled. From the edges the judgments thickened. A man in a flannel shirt, probably a local rancher with calloused hands and a narrow worldview, leaned toward his companion. "See that? Biker sniffing around the kid. Probably up to no good. Folks like him don't mix with ours." The words stung like road rash, but Jax let them slide off, his focus on Timmy, who now edged toward the stage, emboldened by the unexpected company. Harlan finished with Emily, handing her a wrapped toy from a sack at his feet, and his gaze locked on Timmy. "Come on up, son," he boomed, waving a mittened hand. But as Timmy took a tentative step, another family surged forward. A dad with a beer gut and a forced grin, towing twin boys who shoved past without apology. Timmy froze, the exclusion hitting like a slap, his small body tensing as if bracing for impact. Jax's jaw clenched, a quiet rage simmering beneath the surface, not the explosive kind but the controlled burn of a man who'd learned to channel fury into action. He placed a light hand on Timmy's back this time, guiding him forward with the barest pressure. "Your turn," he murmured. His voice a low rumble that cut through the noise. The shoving dad paused, turning with a scowl, his eyes flicking over Jax's vest. "Hey, pal, back off. Family line here." The challenge hung, laced with the town's undercurrent of fear. Bikers as outsiders, heartless drifters who disrupted the fragile order. Jax met his gaze evenly, his breath steady, hands open at his sides. "Kid's got a wish. Let him through." It wasn't a threat, just a statement, heavy with the weight of unspoken loyalty. Harlan cleared his throat from the stage, his Santa voice amplifying. "Room for everyone, folks. Ho, 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 Timmy, right? Climb up here and tell me what you're dreaming of." The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers buzzing like static, but Timmy moved, Jax's presence a silent anchor. As the boy ascended the steps, his steps tentative but gaining strength, Jax hung back, the desert wind tugging at his jacket like an old regret. The fair's lights hummed to life around them, casting warm glows that softened the edges of judgment, if only for a moment. Timmy sat on Santa's knee, his voice small but clear as he spoke of simple things, a bike of his own, lights that stayed on through winter. Harlan listened, nodding solemnly, slipping a small gift into the boy's hands. Jax watched from the shadows, the scene etching into him like a new tattoo, the humanity of it piercing the armor he'd built mile by mile. The town saw monsters in the margins, but here, in the quiet act of stepping forward, the truth peeled back. Compassion wasn't weakness. It was the engine that kept the brotherhood alive. Timmy glanced back once, a shy smile breaking through, and Jax nodded, the knot in his chest loosening just a fraction. But the night was young, and the road ahead twisted with revelations yet to come, where loyalty would demand more than a single stand. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and loyalty can travel. The lights of the fairgrounds strung out like fragile veins against the deepening twilight, pulsing with a warmth that did little to chase the chill settling over Willow Creek. Jax lingered at the edge of the crowd, his boots rooted in the packed dirt. The scent of damp earth rising as the first hints of evening dew clung to the grass. Timmy had descended from the stage moments ago, clutching the small wrapped package Harlan had pressed into his hands. A wooden toy truck, nothing fancy, but the boy's fingers traced its edges with a reverence that spoke of treasures long denied. He shot Jax another glance, that shy smile flickering before he darted off toward the shadowed fringes of the tents where the overflow of families huddled against the wind. Jax watched him go, the knot in his chest twisting tighter, a reminder that one act couldn't mend the fractures life had carved, but the confrontation lingered like exhaust in still air. The dad from the line, the one with the beer gut and the scowl, hadn't backed down easily. He stood now a few yards away, flanked by his twins who tugged at his sleeves, oblivious to the tension coiling in their father's stance. The man's face was flushed, not from the cold, but from the slight Jax had delivered, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the biker like a threat to the town's fragile peace. "You think you can just muscle in here playing hero?" he spat, his voice carrying just loud enough to draw heads turning, the murmurs swelling like a gathering storm. Jax met his gaze steadily, his hands loose at his sides, calluses catching the faint glow from a nearby lantern. No fists clenched, no bark to match the bite. Just the quiet weight of a man who'd learned that rage unchecked burned everything in its path. The crowd shifted uneasily, a ripple of judgment passing through them, women clutching their purses tighter, a father pulling his daughter closer, the unspoken narrative painting Jax as the outsider disrupting the holiday charade. Lila appeared at the periphery, her tray balanced precariously with empty cider cups, her eyes flicking between the two men with a mix of concern and quiet resolve. She knew Jax from the diner runs, had seen him leave tips that covered more than coffee, but to the others, he was the embodiment of their fears, leather-clad wanderer, heart hidden under patches and scars. "Easy now," she murmured, stepping between them like a buffer, her voice soft but edged with the exhaustion of mediating small-town fractures. The dad ignored her, stepping closer to Jax, his breath reeking of cheap ale from the beer tent. "We don't need your kind stirring up the kids. Ride on back to whatever hole you crawled from." Jax's breath came even, measured, the controlled inhale of someone who'd stared down worse than playground posturing, nights in desert foxholes where the line between ally and enemy blurred in the sand, or the barroom haze where a brother's blood stained the floor and loyalty demanded silence over surrender. He thought of Jamie, his own boy, left with a mother who'd pleaded for him to stay clean, to choose family over the road's siren call. The guilt was a constant companion, heavier than the saddlebags strapped to his bike, and moments like this unearthed it, raw and unrelenting. "Wasn't stirring anything," Jax replied, his tone low, gravel under tires. "Just making sure the kid got his turn. That's all." The man's laugh was bitter, short, drawing more eyes, the rancher from earlier nodding in agreement, his arms crossed like a barricade. "Yeah, right. Bikers like you always got an angle. Protecting? That's a joke. You're the ones who leave messes for folks like us to clean up." The words landed like accusations Jax had heard 1,000 times, from judges in courtrooms to whispers in garages. The world reducing the Ironhawks to villains in their own story. But beneath the leather beat a code forged in fire. No one hurts those we protect. It wasn't about glory or grand gestures. It was the steady choice to stand, even when the ground shifted beneath you. Jax felt the pull of the highway calling, the engine's promise of escape, but his feet stayed planted. the desert wind tugging at his collar like a tether to unfinished business. Lila set her tray down on a nearby crate, the clink of porcelain cutting the tension like a pause in a tense standoff. "He's right about the kid," she said, addressing the dad directly, her hands twisting the hem of her apron, a subtle tremor betraying the compassion she extended like a lifeline. "Timmy's mom works doubles at the mill cleanup. They don't get much. Let it go." The dad hesitated, his bluster faltering under her steady gaze, the twins now whining about the cold, pulling him toward the warmth of the food stalls. He muttered something under his breath, a parting shot about watching your back and before turning away, the crowd dispersing with him, their judgments lingering like the fading echo of footsteps on gravel. Jax exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cooling air, his shoulders easing just a fraction. Harlan climbed down from the stage, shedding the Santa beard as he approached, his face lined with the day's wear, but his eyes holding a glint of approval. "Appreciate the backup," he said quietly, clapping Jax on the arm with a hand that smelled of pine from the artificial tree. "Town's on edge this time of year, budget's tight, tempers shorter, but you did good." Jax nodded, the praise sitting uneasy, a reminder that redemption wasn't a single ride, but a series of detours. He scanned the fairgrounds, spotting Timmy now at the edge, the boy unwrapping his gift under the dim light of a booth, his face illuminated by a quiet joy that pierced the dusk. But the moment's peace fractured as a woman's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp, edged with panic. "Timmy, Timmy, where are you?" It was Ellie, the single mom from the diner and the roadside fix, her coat flapping open as she pushed through the crowd, eyes wild with the fear of a parent who'd lost sight of her anchor. She reached the boy just as he looked up, the toy truck tumbling from his hands into the dirt. "What happened? Who gave you this?" Her gaze landed on Jax, recognition dawning mixed with wariness, her hands trembling as she pulled Timmy close, shielding him instinctively. The dad's earlier words echoed in the air, amplifying her doubt, the town's invisible lines drawing tight around the vulnerable. Jack stepped back, giving them space, but the connection hit him like a sudden downshift. The boy was hers, the trembling hands from last night now wrapped around a son who carried the same quiet hunger. Internal conflict surged, the road's freedom clashing with the pull of loyalty, the unspoken guilt of his own abandoned fatherhood rising like bile. Ellie met his eyes, searching, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain on asphalt, promising a storm that would test the fragile bonds forming in the shadows. Jax turned toward his bike, the metal cool under his palm. But he knew this wasn't over. The code demanded more, and the night stretched ahead. Heavy with the weight of choices yet to be made, the rain began as a fine mist, kissing the fairgrounds with a chill that turned the lights into hazy halos, the air thick with the scent of wet pine and smoldering chestnuts from dying vendor fires. Ellie held Timmy close, her arms a tight circle around his small frame, the boy's face buried against her side, as if the world might swallow him whole if she let go. Her eyes, shadowed by exhaustion and the day's unrelenting worry, locked onto Jax's, a storm of questions brewing behind them. Recognition flickered there, the roadside repair under pouring skies, his hands steady on her engine while hers shook on the wheel, but it warred with the fresh wave of suspicion fed by the town's whispers. "You," she said, her voice barely above the patter on the tent roofs, edged with a tremor that spoke of too many nights wondering who might be friend or foe. Timmy peeked out, clutching the now muddy toy truck, his earlier joy dimmed like a bulb, flickering in the damp. Jax stood still, the rain beading on his leather vest, tracing cold paths down his neck that he ignored, his focus on the pair before him. The crowd had thinned further, families huddling under awnings or heading to trucks with engines coughing to life in the lot, but a few lingered, their gazes lingering too, curious, accusatory, the invisible web of judgment tightening. Harlan hovered nearby, his Santa suit discarded in a heap by the stage, now just a grease monkey in overalls, wiping his hands on a rag as if to clean away the awkwardness. "Ellie, it's all right," he interjected softly, stepping into the space between them, his voice carrying the gravel of a man who'd mediated worse than playground squabbles. "Jax, here's the one fixed your alternator last night. Gave the boy his Santa time, too. No harm in that." But the words hung tentative, the rain amplifying the silence that followed, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder rolling in from the desert like an approaching convoy. Ellie's grip on Timmy eased fractionally, but her posture remained guarded, shoulders drawn high against the downpour that now slicked her hair to her forehead. She glanced at the toy in her son's hands, the wooden edges darkened by mud, and something softened in her expression, a flicker of gratitude battling the ingrained caution of a woman who'd learned to trust sparingly. "Why?" she asked Jax directly, her breath visible in quick puffs. Rain mingling with the unshed tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. "Why help us, strangers like you? You don't just do that without wanting something." The question cut deeper than the cold, echoing Jax's own internal fracture. The road had taught him isolation was safer, yet here he was, pulled back by the echo of his own failures. His son Jamie's face surfaced unbidden, last seen at 5, waving from the porch as Jax rode away, the divorce papers fresh and the VA checks too sparse to bridge the gap. He'd sent money when he could, anonymous envelopes through old contacts, but distance had become his shield, loyalty twisted into absence. Jax shifted his weight, the gravel mushy under his boots, releasing a faint, earthy scent that grounded him. "Don't want anything," he replied, his tone even, laced with the quiet resolve of someone who'd stared down sandstorms and bar fights alike. Saw the kid needed a turn, that's it. But inside, the tension coiled tighter, a moral suspense gripping him like handlebars on a slick curve. The dad's earlier confrontation replayed in his mind, the man's parting glare from across the lot, now joined by a couple of locals clustering near the beer tent, their murmurs rising with the rain's intensity. One of them, the rancher with the narrow eyes, pointed subtly in Jax's direction, his companion nodding as they pulled out phones, the glow of screens cutting through the dusk like accusations. External pressure mounted, the town's fragile tolerance fraying. Bikers weren't saviors here, they were sparks to dry tinder, and Jax felt the heat building, his presence a catalyst for the unrest simmering beneath the holiday veneer. Timmy tugged at his mother's coat, his voice small against the growing downpour. "He helped me, Mum. Santa listened because of him." Ellie's hand stroked the boy's wet hair, a gesture so tender it pierced Jax's armor, stirring the compassion he'd buried under miles of asphalt. She met his eyes again, searching deeper this time, the rain washing away some of the wariness. "We're not strangers then, not entirely. Thank you, for the car, for this." But her words trailed off as a shout cut through the storm. The dad from earlier, emerging from the shadows of a food stall, his flannel shirt darkening with rain, flanked now by 2 others, their faces set in the hard lines of men who'd nursed grudges over warm beers. "Told you to back off," the man bellowed, closing the distance with purposeful strides, water splashing up from puddles like punctuation to his anger. "Now you're hanging around her kid. What kind of game is this?" The escalation hit like a sudden skid, Jax's body tensing instinctively, muscles honed from years of riding tight formations with the Hawks coiling for defense. But he held back, breath steady, hands open, controlled rage tempered by the code that valued protection over provocation. Harlan moved forward, positioning himself as a barrier, his broad frame blocking the path. "Cool it, Roy. Fair's no place for this." The crowd that remained paused, umbrellas tilting like periscopes, the air electric with anticipation, judgment solidifying, the biker stirring trouble. The single mom drawing it in, the outcasts clashing in the margins. Ellie pulled Timmy behind her, her body a shield, trembling faintly but unyielding, the weight of her solitude crashing against Jax's resolve. Internal conflict raged. Ride away, preserve the fragile peace he'd found in solitude, or stand firm, invoking the Brotherhood's silent justice that saw vulnerability as a call to arms. Jax stepped sideways, angling to cover Ellie and the boy without escalating, the rain now sheeting down, blurring the lines between them all. "No game," he said to Roy, voice low but carrying over the roar on the tents, "just doing what's right." Roy's companions hung back, uneasy, but the man's face twisted, fueled by the storm and the sting of his earlier retreat. A shove came then, Roy's hand connecting with Jax's shoulder, not hard enough to topple, but enough to ignite the powder keg. Jax absorbed it, staggering half a step, the impact jarring through his frame like a misfired engine. Compassion warred with the urge to retaliate, his mind flashing to Jamie's trusting eyes, the second chances he'd denied himself. He could end this with a single swing, years of veteran reflexes begging for release, but the code whispered restraint, protect, don't destroy. Ellie gasped, clutching Timmy tighter, her strained breathing audible even in the downpour. "Stop, please, just stop." Her plea hung, a thread of humanity pulling at the frayed edges. Roy hesitated, the rain masking the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the crowd's murmurs shifting from condemnation to discomfort. Harlan gripped Roy's arm, murmuring low urgings to walk it off, and slowly the man backed down, muttering curses as he retreated into the gloom, his friends trailing like shadows. The tension eased, but not fully, the air heavy with the aftermath, the unspoken threats, the judgments etched deeper. Jax wiped rain from his face, his heart pounding a steady rhythm, the internal storm raging on. How far would loyalty take him before it cost everything? Ellie watched him, a new layer of understanding in her gaze as thunder cracked overhead, promising revelations in the deluge ahead. The fairgrounds emptied further, engines humming to life in the distance. But Jax remained, the pull of compassion anchoring him against the tide. The thunder rolled closer, a low growl that vibrated through the fairgrounds like the distant rumble of a convoy approaching from the horizon. Rain hammered the tents now, turning the packed dirt into a slick mire that sucked at Jax's boots with every step, the cold seeping up from the ground to match the chill knotting his spine. Ellie stood there, water streaming down her face in rivulets that blurred her features. Timmy pressed against her legs, his small body shivering not just from the wet, but from the echo of the near fracas. Her eyes held Jax's, that newfound understanding flickering like a faulty bulb, gratitude laced with the wariness of someone who'd been burned by kindness before. "We should get inside," she said, her voice barely cutting through the downpour, one hand shielding Timmy's head while the other gathered the fallen toy truck, its wood now swollen and dark. Jax nodded, the motion automatic, but his gaze flicked to the lot where shadows moved under the sodium glow of parking lights, figures emerging from trucks, their silhouettes bulky with rain gear and intent. Roy hadn't gone far. He'd rallied a few more, the rancher among them, their low voices carrying on the wind like threats wrapped in small-town solidarity. The escalation brewed in the air, thick as the ozone before a strike, the town's judgments coalescing into something tangible, a mob born from fear of the outsider who dared to intervene. Jax's pulse quickened, not with fear but with the steady burn of resolve, his hands flexing at his sides, calluses rough against the damp leather of his gloves. He'd faced worse, ambushes in sun-baked alleys where loyalty meant covering your brother's flank, or the courtroom silence after the fight that cost him everything. But this felt personal, the pull of protection clashing against the instinct to ride free. Harlan clapped a hand on Jax's shoulder, his grip firm, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. "Head to the community hall. Lyle has got coffee going. I'll handle the stragglers." But even as he spoke, Roy's group closed in, boots splashing through puddles, faces set in the hard lines of men who'd nursed slights over diner counters and bar stools. Roy led, his flannel clinging like a second skin, eyes locked on Jax with a venom sharpened by the storm. "Thought you were done," he snarled, stopping a few feet away, water sluicing off his jacket. "But now I see it, hanging around her, the kid. What's your play, biker? Trying to look good while you scout for trouble?" The words landed heavy, amplified by his companion's nods, the rancher muttering about calling the sheriff. Their collective distrust, a wall that painted Jax not as protector, but predator. Ellie tensed, pulling Timmy closer, her breath coming in strained hitches that Jax could hear over the rain's relentless tattoo. "Leave us alone," she said, her voice cracking on the edge of defiance. But Roy ignored her, stepping forward until he was inches from Jax, the heat of his anger cutting through the cold. Internal conflict tore at Jax. The code screamed to shield them, to stand unyielding. But the ghosts of his past whispered retreat. Jamie's birthday cards returned unopened, the years of silence that had calcified his heart into something armored and alone. He'd chosen the road after the discharge, after the nights where flashbacks turned his hands to weapons, thinking absence was mercy. But here, in the mud and the glare, mercy felt like cowardice, loyalty demanding he face the storm head-on. A shove came then, Roy's palm slamming into Jax's chest, the force sending him back a step, boots sliding in the muck. The impact jarred through him, reigniting old aches from road spills and bar brawls. But Jax held his ground, breath steady, eyes never leaving Roy's. "Back off," he said low. The words a rumble like idling engines, controlled rage simmering beneath. The group tightened, one of them, a wiry man with a fisherman's cap, grabbing Jax's arm, twisting with a grunt. Pain flared, sharp and electric, but Jax twisted free, his movements precise, veteran-honed, not wild. Ellie gasped, Timmy's cry piercing the din, and in that split second, the boy's face blurred with Jamie's. Same wide eyes, same unspoken plea, and the revelation cracked open inside Jax like lightning splitting the sky. He was a father, not just in memory, but in the marrow of every choice that had led him here. The divorce had severed legal ties, but the guilt bound him tighter than any chain, a hidden truth he'd buried under miles and missions. Timmy wasn't his, but in this moment, the connection reframed everything, the act of kindness at the roadside, the step toward Santa's stage, now threads in a larger tapestry of redemption. Roy lunged again, fist swinging in a sloppy arc, grazing Jax's jaw with a thud that split his lip, copper blooming on his tongue. The taste grounded him, compassion surging over the urge to strike back. He couldn't become the monster they saw, not with the boy watching, not when loyalty meant rising above the fray. Harlan waded in, shoving Roy back with a mechanic's strength, his voice booming. "Enough! Sheriff's on his way! Take it home!" The rancher hesitated, phoned to his ear, but the rain's fury seemed to douse their fire, the group faltering as sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Cutting through the thunder, Roy spat into the mud, glaring at Jax one last time. "This ain't over. Folks like you don't belong." He turned, his crew trailing, leaving the air thick with the aftermath. Strained breathing, the patter of rain on cooling metal from the rides. Ellie stepped forward, tentative, her hand brushing Jax's arm, where the twist had left a bruise blooming under his sleeve. "You're bleeding," she whispered, concern etching her face, Timmy peeking out with wide eyes that held no fear now, only awe. Jax wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, the sting a small price, his chest heaving with the weight of the unspoken. "Been worse," he murmured, meeting her gaze, the revelation hanging between them like the mist rising from the warm asphalt. He'd stepped forward for Timmy, but in doing so, cracked open his own buried life. The single dad who'd failed once, now fighting to reclaim the man beneath the leather. The sirens grew louder, red and blue lights piercing the gloom, but Jax felt no urge to run. The road could wait, for here in the deluge, silent justice took root, binding outcasts in a fragile alliance against the judging night. Ellie nodded, a small smile breaking through, as thunder echoed once more, promising the storm's pivot toward dawn. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Jax reach more people who still believe in humanity. The sirens wailed into silence as the sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the fairground's edge, its lights slicing through the rain like hesitant beacons, casting erratic shadows on the sodden tents. Jax stood unmoving, the metallic tang of blood lingering on his split lip, mingling with the earthy petrichor rising from the ground. The downpour had eased to a steady drizzle, droplets tracing slow paths down his face, washing away the grime of the scuffle, but not the deeper stains of the night. Ellie hovered nearby, Timmy tucked against her side, the boy's small hand clutching the damp toy truck as if it were a talisman against the chaos. Her eyes, softened by the ordeal, held a quiet acknowledgement. The wariness from earlier dissolved into something tentative, like trust taking its first breath after a long submersion. The sheriff, a lanky man named Carver, with a mustache grayed by years of mediating dust-ups in Willow Creek, stepped out, his boots splashing into puddles that reflected the fading lights. He scanned the scene with practiced detachment, Harlan wiping rain from his eyes, the scattered remnants of Roy's group slinking toward their trucks, engines coughing reluctantly to life in the lot. "What in the hell happened here?" Carver asked, his voice carrying the gravel of someone who'd rather be home by the fire. Roy, lingering at the periphery with arms crossed, muttered about biker trouble, his glare fixed on Jax like a promise deferred. But Ellie stepped forward before the narrative could solidify, her voice steady despite the shiver in her frame. "Nothing started it, Jax. He helped Timmy, stood up when no one else did." Carver's gaze shifted to Jax, appraising the vest, the bruise blooming on his jaw, then to the boy whose wide eyes mirrored the innocence of the moment that had sparked it all. Jax met the sheriff's look without flinching, his breath evening out, the controlled rhythm of a man who'd learned to let silence speak when words invited more knots. No need to recount the shoves, the accusations. The code of the Iron Hawks was etched in restraint, in choosing the long road over the quick spark. Carver sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, rain dripping from his hat brim. "Roy, you and your boys head home. Fair's over for tonight. And you?" He nodded at Jax. "Appreciate the assist, but don't make it a habit." It wasn't absolution, just the pragmatic truce of a town too worn to unravel every thread. Roy spat into the mud one last time, his truck's taillights blurring into the mist as he drove off, the rancher and the others following suit, their judgments trailing like exhaust fumes, fading but never fully dispersed. Harlan clapped Jax on the back again, lighter this time, his hand lingering in a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes without fanfare. "Come on, let's get you dried off." Community halls got hot coffee, and a few hawks who rolled in late heard the rumble on the CB. The mention of the Brotherhood stirred something in Jax, a quiet warmth cutting through the chill. Brothers scattered across the states, but always converging when the call came, their loyalty a web invisible to the world, but unbreakable. They weren't in Willow Creek tonight, not all of them, but the echo was there, in Harlan's nod, in Lila's distant figure waving from the hall's doorway, thermos in hand. Jax followed, Ellie and Timmy falling in step beside him, the group's movement a subtle formation, protective without proclamation. Inside the hall, the air hung heavy with the scent of brewed coffee and damp wool, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like hesitant fireflies. A few locals milled about, volunteers folding chairs, a waitress stacking leftover cups, their glances at Jax carrying less edge now, softened by the night's unraveling. Ellie settled Timmy at a table with a blanket from the lost and found, the boy yawning, his eyelids heavy as he fiddled with the toy truck's wheels, the simple motion a balm after the storm. She turned to Jax, pouring him a mug from the percolator, steam rising in lazy curls that fogged the space between them. "I didn't know," she said softly, handing it over, her fingers brushing his. Warm, tentative. "About your son. The way you looked at Timmy, like you saw someone else." Jax took the mug, the ceramic hot against his palms, grounding him as he leaned against the wall, the wood paneling cool and splintered under his shoulder. The revelation from the rain hadn't been voiced, not fully, but it hung there, raw and exposed. The hidden truth of a father who'd ridden away from cribs and chaos, a veteran carrying the weight of deployments that had fractured his home, leaving Jamie with a mother who built walls higher than Jax could scale. "Lost him years ago," he murmured, his voice low, the words tasting of old asphalt and regret. "Not to death, to choices. Thought the road would keep the shadows away, from him, from her, but it just followed." Ellie's eyes welled, not with pity but recognition, her own life a mirror of margins, single mom in a town that whispered judgments, scraping by on shifts that left her hands chapped and her heart frayed. "Choices can bend back," she said, her breath catching slightly, a long pause stretching as she glanced at Timmy, now dozing with his head on the table. "Forgiveness starts small, with a step forward." The hall emptied gradually, the hum of conversations fading into the patter of residual rain on the tin roof, engines cooling outside in the dark lot. Harlan joined them briefly, sharing a story of a hawk run years back, sandbagging a river, no questions asked, his words weaving the Brotherhood's compassion into the fabric of the night. Jax listened, the knot in his chest loosening, the moral suspense of the evening, resolving not in triumph but in quiet survival. Loyalty as the bridge over guilt, community as the outcast's silent justice. He thought of calling his ex, of that first envelope with more than money, a letter perhaps, cracking the silence. Ellie smiled faintly as Timmy stirred, murmuring about walking them home, the offer simple, unburdened. As the first hints of dawn grayed the windows, Jax stepped out into the clearing air, the desert wind carrying the faint scent of wet sage. His bike waited, faithful sentinel, but the pull to ride alone felt diminished, replaced by the fragile thread connecting him to this place, to Ellie, to Timmy, to the hidden hearts beating beneath the leather and the labels. He fired the engine, the rumble a low confession, and glanced back at the hall's warm glow, where figures moved like embers in the fading night. In the quiet justice of second chances, even the road bent toward home. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of Santa invited every child to sit, except one, until the single dad stepped forward. See you in the next one.